Okay, so not too long ago I talked about a mob movie directed by an unlikely person that, while having its moments and being definitely enjoyable, wasn't exactly all it could have been. So let's look at one from the 90s, brought to us by the director of such beloved timeless gems as the one and only Sister Act 2. That movie nut here with a review for Hoodlum, the 1997 gangster film starring Laurence Fishburne, Tim Roth, Andy Garcia and Vanessa Williams. The story centers on three of the most famous gangsters of all time, Bumpy Johnson, Dutch Schultz, and of course, Lucky Luciano. Bumpy has just been released from Sing Sing prison and returns to Harlem only to find it under threat by the psychopathic Dutch Schultz, who is determined to get a control on the numbers racket, being run at present by one of Bumpy's old employers, Madame Queen. Eventually, Dutch steps over the line, ignoring the wishes of the big boss Luciano, and takes the fight much more directly to the Queen, which ultimately results in Bumpy stepping up to the plate and these two gangster legends having a fight to end all fights for control of Harlem. Yet again, we find ourselves dealing with an ensemble cast with the likes of Laurence Fishburne, Tim Roth, Andy Garcia, Vanessa Williams, and even some odd faces you might recognize from bit parts in movies or TV like Cicely Tyson, Clarence Williams III, and we've even got a young Queen Latifah in here. But of course, the big three you all want to hear about is Garcia, Roth, and Fishburne. All three do really well in their roles. Though unfortunately, Garcia gets to do the least, as much like De Niro in Untouchables, he's the big crime boss and mainly sits around in various clubs and hotels. But even so, with the limited screen time he is really good. From little details like one of his eyes being slightly closed, almost in a lazy state, and even the ring he wears is actually one of Luciano's real rings, to more broader things such as his strange, distant, perpetual calm that no matter how bad things get or whatever is threatening his organization, he always maintains a strange, distant calm as if he's above the material. Almost sort of embracing a godlike attitude, which certainly fits being pretty much the de facto big crime boss. Most of the focus is of course on our two main gangsters played by Fishburne and Roth respectively. Roth, as you'd expect, does really well in this role and just hams it up for all it's worth, right down to having a snarky, toothy grin and an incredibly cocky attitude throughout, and he is a lot of fun to watch. While Fishburne gives the role of Bumpy Johnson a great degree of dignity and integrity, you get the feeling that he is really committed to his profession and doing whatever it takes to bring down Schultz, even if it means going against the wishes of his superiors and some of his friends. And the rest of the cast, such as Vanessa Hughes as pretty much the requisite girlfriend of Bumpy Johnson, and Cicely Tyson as, of course, Madame Queen, all do perfectly fine in their roles and pretty much play the characters the way you would expect them to, given the archetypes that they all represent. Though strangely, one character, Whispers, played by Paul Benjamin, seems strangely out of place, always having a very whispery, husky voice, almost like a real-life Darth Vader in a way. And though the actor isn't necessarily bad, he just seems really cartoonish and strangely out of place in the film. But anyway, moving on, the production values here are for the most part pretty good, and all the expected elements that you would think would be in a 1930s gangster piece are all here. Fedoras, trench coats, silky dresses, Tommy guns, vintage cars, bright neon nightclubs. It's all here, and for the most part it looks pretty good, though at times a little too cleaned up and setish, but I'll get to that in a bit. However, the real kicker is the cinematography. This is probably some of the most bland and dull cinematography I have ever seen for a big studio period piece. It feels like glorified television. A lot of the angles chosen, I was thinking, what? Why would you shoot it like that? You don't shoot that scene from that angle. It looks flat, boring, and it looks like something you'd see on TV. A great example is one scene when Bumpy is walking his girl home after a dance at one of the clubs and it's raining down, and they shoot the street dead on straight. They don't do an angle or anything. And all I could think was, why would you shoot it like that? That makes it look like a set. It doesn't make it look like a good street. It doesn't even make the shot look nice. It looks really flat. And it doesn't help that the lighting within that is also really flat. There is very little atmosphere here. The lighting is just flat. Everything is lit a little too brightly, and it means that a lot of scenes that could have had more atmosphere, perhaps with some clever use of shadows, are not here. And this detracts a lot from the film's feel, which you'd think would be a no-brainer because this is meant to be a 1930s period piece. Though thankfully a saving grace to the presentation is the score by veteran Elmer Bernstein, who some of you might best recognize from the likes of Airplane and Ghostbusters. Bernstein delivers a pretty solid score with plenty of percussion, some strings, and a bit of saxophone thrown in there just to very firmly cement it in 1930s Harlem. And it underscores a lot of the movie very well, with the pretty good moment at the end where the music reaches a good crescendo. Thanks to some skillful combinations of brass, string, and percussion, which help end the film on a much more poignant and stronger note, not to mention elevate a lot of the atmosphere that the film doesn't have thanks to pedestrian camera work. But of course, the most important element here is the script, written by Chris Bracanto, a man whose background is mostly television. Oh, and I neglected to mention earlier, the cinematographer, his background is television as well. See where I'm going with this? The big problem with this film is that it doesn't feel very filmic. It feels like a pilot for a potential series, or even a couple of episodes smushed together. And as a result, we get a narrative that doesn't feel so much like one whole movie so much as just a patchwork of episodes, kind of like how in the 90s they would take animated shows and cut them together into movies to slap on VHS tapes, and that's what this feels like, albeit with a lot more money and bigger names behind it. Look, I'm not trying to insult anybody in the audience here who might be into television or works in television. You guys, you do a good job. But the fact is, when I pay to see a movie, I expect to see a movie. It feels incredibly episodic. The film frequently uses a lot of blackouts to indicate the passage of time, which frankly look like they were done on the grandfather of Windows Movie Maker. And very frequently the narrative will also jump weeks, months, even years, which again just leads me to feel like this at some point was meant to be a television series that they decided to promote to a movie. And as a byproduct of that, a lot of potential character development and interesting ideas are really laid to the wayside. The possibilities of exploring who Bumpy is, of making Dutch Schultz more than just another run-of-the-mill psychopathic gangster, of maybe even looking at the extent of what these operations do on both sides, looking at how big Luciano's empire is, maybe even getting into more of the relationship between Bumpy and his girlfriend, who works as this charity worker and tries to help him go on the straight and narrow. But a lot of this is just so cut up because of the constant time jumps. The girlfriend goes from being very questioning and doubtful of Bumpy's criminal background to being absolutely in love with him, even though we don't really see it really change or progress, and then she suddenly switches back to being doubtful. Because you skip so much time, we don't really get a sense of this relationship, and it feels very half-hearted. In fact, the film itself raises a question of what can a black man do outside of crime in a place like Harlem. That would have been really interesting to explore, and it would have given the film a lot more depth, but nope. Not to mention, the televisual stuff doesn't extend just to that, but also an imbalance in the tone, and sometimes the quality of the film itself. For instance, the opening tile sequence is done with these big CGI coins, which look pretty nice, even after all these years, but then we cut to probably one of the cheapest text crawls you will ever see in a movie. We see Bumpy's cousin, Illinois Gordon, being funny and cracking jokes throughout the film, but then we'll see scenes of people getting their private parts ripped off by Schultz. For a lot of the movie, it sells for a very pedestrian, bland cinematography style that really doesn't do the production values any service, but then at points it'll try and be artsy by having, say, CG coins dripping down as a transition, or maybe they'll do a radical zoom in or a sudden color contrast to try and make things more edgy or more unusual. And all I could think was, no, movie, I do not accept your attempts at being artsy when you've deliberately chosen to be very half-hearted and lazy, despite the fact that you've got a pretty sizable budget and a good cast at your disposal. And in the end, the film just feels like one big missed opportunity. The idea of all these big gangsters meeting up and having this fight is really interesting, but because of the episodic format, it's really chopped up. Hell, the film even resorts to using a montage in the middle, which again takes away from a lot of potentially good scenes and action, and ultimately the end product suffers because of it. I have no doubt that maybe at some point Bill Duke really wanted to do this movie, but perhaps because of the success of Sister Act 2 they had just before this, maybe he thought it would just follow him to it and he could just half-ass this. Well, the end product speaks for itself. And so, in conclusion, I must regrettably give Hoodlum a bronze star. It does have its moments, and it does boast a good cast who do try, plus a pretty good musical score, but in the end, this is just a really disappointing film. If you want a good Bumpy Johnson, Dutch Schultz movie, I say stick with Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club.